Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today, we begin our study of the text of the book of Iyov, the book of Job. And we so far just had a little bit of an introduction. In the introduction, I concentrated mostly on the idea, on the problem of theodicy, which is why good things happen to bad people and why bad things happen to good people. This issue, and I discussed then different approaches that have been used over the ages by various religious and philosophical groups and the inadequacies of those explanations. This book is going to delve into pretty much all of those, and we will find out by the end of the book from God himself the answer to the question. That should tantalize you into thinking, ooh, we're going to get to know the answer. I hope I don't ruin the excitement for you by telling you that at the end of the book we will still be left without any good answers. But actually that itself will be the best answer of all, which is something we will be studying together. This book, all of us, we see ourselves in it when we read through it. We see ourselves, we see the suffering that we may have gone through in our own lives, although in most of the listeners here, it would pale in comparison to the terrible suffering of the main protagonist of this story, which is Iyov, Job himself. Although some listeners may have gone through a terrible, horrific suffering. But certainly when we look at history, we don't have to go very far back to see and know of people, innocent people, people that we know of as being good, or even if they weren't perfect, but certainly not deserving of the terrible, terrible suffering that they have went through. We also know of people that are dishonest, abusive, that seem to be successful. And so these issues being dealt with here are issues that we all deal with all the time. I want to mention of all of the different approaches to theodicy, one approach is the one that is not considered at all in this book. And you and I are going to study this together, and we will see. And that is the one approach that Iyov is being tested to avoid. And that is the approach and the idea that it's all random. There is no point. There is no God. The world is the way it is, and that's just it. There's no purpose to existence. There's no purpose to the world. There's no reason for us to be here. There's no such thing as faith in anything because nothing exists. This concept is the one concept that, as we shall see, is one that people can be driven towards, but Iyov, because of his righteousness, never even entertains, despite numerous reasons to entertain that idea and that notion. I want to point out Maimonides, the Rambam, in Moreh Nevuchim, in his seminal work on philosophy, Guide for the Perplexed, in chapter 20 of part 2 of Guide for the Perplexed. The Rambam there is discussing his argument, his fundamental argument and disagreement with Aristotle. Whereas Aristotle believes that the laws of nature are forever, and because the laws of nature are forever, and the laws of nature dictate that a universe such as the one that we see in front of us exists, therefore this universe must have always existed in the state that we see it in, right? Because the laws of nature were always the same. So just like the laws of nature lead to the world we see, it should always have been that way, and therefore there was never a time of creation. Whereas Rambam then says, I disagree with Aristotle's opinion, not because I can prove it, but because I can disprove his proof, right? In other words, Aristotle seems to say, well, the laws of nature don't change, and therefore the world should always have been. Rambam says no, because the laws of nature do not change, but they were created at the time of creation. and therefore there is a creator. And the Rambam goes back and forth, and right now is not the place to discuss this philosophical debate. But it is the place for me to point out the one main point that the Rambam makes in chapter 20, and it's worthwhile looking there yourself if you want to see it. Why does it matter, the Rambam says? He says, Aristotle has his points, I have my points. He can't prove me wrong, and I can't prove him wrong. But why is it so fundamental for me to state that there was a moment of creation and that there is a creator that created the world? Why is that important? Because the Rambam says, if God decided, so to speak, obviously doesn't decide the way we decide, to create a world at a specific moment in time, which is again also a misnomer because Rambam points out that time itself was created at that time. So this is kind of a circular sentence. That means he did it for a purpose, for a reason, right? And according to and Maimonides points out that while the reason is not self-evident from within the world, that reason, as we are being taught by the Torah and by the prophets, that reason is for us to be better people, for us to follow the rules that God laid down for us, the guidance that he gave us, which enables us to search for and eventually achieve and reach truth, an intellectual truth, which according to Rambam requires first an ethical and moral truth, and eventually an intellectual truth. So in other words, if we don't believe in a creator, right, that created the world, then there's no purpose, there's no point. Then everything is the way it is simply because the laws of nature dictate that it should be such. And then there's no point in keeping the Torah, there's no point in keeping any moral or ethical system which could lead people closer to the perfection that God wants from us. There's no point in talking about what God wants. It's this fundamental thing that underlies this entire book, even though the book doesn't even discuss this issue. And you'll see that Eov is going to be said, and I'm going to point this out as we go through the book. But the one thing Eov considers and is challenged by his friends with all kinds of ideas about why good people suffer. But the one thing that he refuses to even consider and doesn't even mention, in other words, this is significant in its absence, is he refuses to even consider that maybe there is no creator, maybe there is no purpose and point, maybe everything is just the way it is because that's the way it has to be, and the laws of science and nature dictate that this is the way it should be. Now, with that introduction, let's begin the book. I mentioned a little bit in the intro that the first two chapters and the end of the last chapter are the story of Eov, written in a narrative style, and the entire bulk of the book, the 40 chapters in between, is written in a poetic style, a very difficult style to read, but a beautiful poetic style. It's written in the style of biblical poetry, and that consists of the debate. And many have pointed out that it's structured in such a way that it seems like it was structured to be a play, something to be performed. So it says a little story, of this and of that, which we'll learn in a minute, and then the play was performed in such a way that each of the characters would come on stage, give their speech as to what they think, and then step off the stage, or then the next person on the stage would say his story and so on. And I'll point out a few places where it sounds this way. Ish haya bi'eretz Utz. There was a man in the land of Oz. Yes, there was a man in the land of Oz. Utz. Now, Utz pops up in various places in Tanakh. It's generally assumed to be a place near the land of Edom, or in the land of Edom, which is southeast of the land of Israel, somewhere in maybe modern-day Jordan, Saudi Arabia. And based on what happens in the story as we read it, it makes sense that this is its location. And Eov Shemo, his name was Eov. Let me point out that the rabbis in Masechet Bava Basra have a debate as to whether or not, exactly when this book was written, whether or not it actually happened even. Many say that this entire book is just a mashal, just a parable. Rambam points out and emphasizes strongly in the More Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, that it is meant to be just a parable. Now, what the Rambam means is not that there never was a guy named Eov. We happen to know from extra-biblical sources, from archaeological sources, that the name Eov in this region was a reasonably common name for a guy. There probably was a guy named Eov, especially since we know in the book of Ezekiel, Eov is mentioned together with two other names, Noach and Danel, who we now know were both figures. Noach, the famous Noah of the Bible, and Danel, very similar to Daniel or Daniel, but we actually know from archaeological sources that Ezekiel was probably not referring to the Daniel, but he was referring to Danel, who was a famous hero in those days, about whom many stories were told of his greatness. So those three were given as examples of great people that accomplished great things, and they were the subject of many of the legends and myths that were told in those days. Eov, Danel, and Noah. Now, so Eov probably existed as a person, but it's a parable in the sense, and the Rambam points out that when we discuss soon about the goings-on in heaven between God and his angels and so on, Rambam says that no matter whether or not you think that this story actually happened, everyone agrees, according to Rambam, that the discussion about what happened with God in the heavens was simply a parable, something that we should not take as an actual event, as a description of God sitting in a court, which Maimonides, in his rationalist way, would certainly not have approved of, and did not approve of, as I just said. So anyway, so this Eov lived in the land of Oz. And this man was Tam. Tam is, we know from how it says in the Torah, Tamim Tiyem Hashem Elokecha, right? You should be, literally Tam could mean perfect or without a flaw, like a carbon, a sacrifice that had a mum, that had a flaw. If it did not have a flaw, then it was Tam, it was perfect, right? Tam is a person who's perfect. He didn't have any errors. V'yashar, and he was straight, literally straight, meaning also translated as upright often. Yashar mean he always does the right thing. So Tam is saying he did not have flaws on the negative side. In other words, he didn't have any negative traits. And he was straight. He always did the right thing. V'yirei Elohim, and he was in fear of God. V'sor meira, and he turned away from bad things. Now, this idea that he feared God is a reference to what I was referring to before, and that is that he had an understanding that there is purpose, right? He understood that there was a creator, and he realized that there is a God, and that there's a reason why we're here. And because of that, V'sar meira, he turned away from evil. This is making the classical biblical argument that when one believes in God, one believes in a purpose, and therefore one turns away from evil. If one does not believe in purpose in the universe, when one thinks it's completely dictated by natural laws, then one has no incentive to turn away from evil. I know this is as atheists may disagree with that, but this is the assertion of the Bible, and here it is being asserted. I personally agree with this assertion, but that's because I'm teaching the Bible. But it's something for us. You can go ahead and debate that with your friends. Vayivoldu lo shiva banim v'shalosh banos, and there was born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Having 7 sons is a particularly wonderful sign of blessing in those days. Yes, it is a little bit misogynistic, but that's what it was in those days. But he had 10 children, which is just a wonderful bounty, his wife was very fertile, and he had, what else could somebody want? Vayihi mikneu shivat alfei tzon. He had 7,000 sheep. That number 7 again, which is a number in the Bible often is when something is complete and whole. It's bountiful and complete. There's 7. Ushloshet alfei gimalim, and 3,000 camels. In a typical, the commentaries point out that in a typically camels, people have less camels than sheep. Camels reproduce slower. And so in a typical wealthy household, they'll have X number of sheep, and less than that number of camels. And camels also are much larger and require much more effort to upkeep. V'chamesh me'os temed bakar, and he had 500 yokes of cattle. These are for work, right, to work the fields. V'chamesh me'ot asonot, and 500 she-donkeys. Va'avuda rabba me'od, and many servants in order to tend to all these flocks and this wealth. Vayahi ha'ish hahu, and this man was gadol mikol b'nei Kedem, was greater than all of the men of the east. So remember, this is being written in the perspective of those in the land of Israel. So the land of Uz, the land of Az, the land of Edom, was to the general east direction of that area. So he was great, meaning here in this term, it's referring to his wealth. He was wealthier than anyone else in the area. And he was also great in the fact, as a leader, as a great name. And his sons went, and what they used to do was they would make a party, Beit Ish Yomo. And each person would have a day, his day, right? Remember, 7 days of the week, there were 7 sons. And not only did they just each one have a party where they invited their brothers, they invited their sisters too. The sisters, of course, did not have property of their own, but it's showing how gracious they were in bringing their sisters along. Le'echol v'lishtos imahem, to eat and drink together with them. This is important for many reasons, but I'm going to zero in on something that I believe this is crucial. We're going to see soon, and I know I'm sorry I'm giving away what we're going to read together, that God considered this behavior to be exemplary and beautiful behavior, right, on the part of the family, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing, because what we see from the book of Job is that God is proud of people when families get together and eat and drink together and enjoy a beautiful family life. God has nothing against the wealth of someone like Eov, who's able to enjoy the pleasures of this world in an honest and upright fashion, right? There's not even an ounce of criticism being leveled here. And in fact, we're going to see soon that God considered Eov to be a wonderful and just and proper person. So this is really kind of sticks in the face of those who try to claim that involving oneself even properly in the pleasures of this world is that there's somehow something wrong with that we should somehow deny ourselves this pleasure. This is a basic fundamental idea we find in the Torah. That's a basic fundamental idea in Judaism, that this kind of behavior is not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to be avoided. We don't pride ourselves on fasting and torturing ourselves. We pride ourselves on living honestly, living upright, living purposely, and so on, but not on avoiding the pleasures of this world. But we know that such partying sometimes can lead, sometimes maybe, to improper thoughts, improper ideas. So when the days of their party was completed, so one gets the sense that this is what they did when they had a 7-day feast. And we know from the Torah that typically the feasts of Pesach, the feasts of Sukkot, the Passover and Sukkot holidays are 7-day feasts. That was a typical time. So when they had the feast, that's how they would celebrate the feast. So Vayishlach Eov would send a message to them, Vayikadchem, and had them purify themselves, meaning they should look into their own character, into their own behavior, and make sure that they didn't make any mistakes. In other words, don't think, if you had a party, maybe you didn't give money to the poor, maybe you didn't treat someone properly, maybe you said something that wasn't nice to someone. So he had them look into themselves to improve themselves, V'hishkim baboker, and he would wake up in the morning after the feast was over, V'hela olot, and he would bring sacrifices, mispar kulam, a sacrifice for each and every one of the children. Remember, this was the way that they would pray in those days. Bringing a sacrifice was the way they prayed. We dealt with this several times, and I quoted to you Maimonides' understanding of how the sacrifices would work. Ki amar Eov, because Eov would say, Ulai chotu vanai, maybe one of my children sinned, uverchu Elohim bilvalvam, and in their hearts they may have cursed God. right? The language Baruch Hu is obviously blessed God, but clearly it's the language of the verse, and we see this many times throughout Tanakh, because the verse doesn't want to stay straight out to curse and to talk about it in the context of God, so it uses the word bless, even though it means the opposite of blessing. Maybe when they drank too much, maybe they cursed God in their hearts. Now, because Eov understood that wealth can also bring one to curse God. So, as we're going to see soon, Satan, we're going to see this soon. We're going to Eov is going to be tested with suffering, which can lead someone to question the existence of God, which is the cursing of God, which we're referring to here, right? The cursing of God meaning saying that maybe God doesn't exist, right? Or maybe God exists but doesn't care, right? He just created the world and then let it roll, or something like that, right? But one can also come to the same mistake through happiness. When one has everything, one becomes arrogant, and one thinks that he deserves all of this because he's the greatest guy or whatever, right? And then come to also flout the rules and disobey the rules and morals that God wants us to keep in this world. So wealth can lead to that as well. And Eov, recognizing this and understanding this, would atone for them and tell them to search into themselves. This is what Eov did on all of these days. So here we have a little story of Eov, the beautiful life that he was living, the wonderful children he had, the wealth that he had, and how faithful he was to God, how he was tam v'yashar, v'yirei Elokim v'sor meira. This was the Eov that we are going to be reading about in this book. I will conclude here the first installment of our book of Job. And thank you so much for studying together with me. Have a wonderful day.